Nobody told me what to do when the princess reached for my hand. There was no protocol for it. I had read every diplomatic courtesy guide the Interplanetary Liaison Office had produced in the last 40 years. Dry documents full of bow angles and gift presentation hierarchies, and the precise number of seconds one was permitted to maintain eye contact with a member of the Veluran royal line before it constituted a challenge. I had memorized the seating arrangements for every ceremonial tier in the Grand Investiture Hall. I had learned enough of the palace's formal dialect to understand most of what was said around me, even the things said quietly, with the reasonable assumption that the humans stationed at the East Colonnade pillar would not catch the nuance. None of those documents addressed what I was supposed to do when a 5-year-old princess walked across 60 feet of marble floor in front of 240 assembled dignitaries, stopped in front of me, and put her small hand in mine. I am getting ahead of myself. That is what my old battalion commander used to say when I started a field report in the middle of the action instead of the beginning. Dale, put your feet on the ground and start where the ground starts. So I will start there. My name is Coran Dale. I spent 14 years in the Frontier Auxiliary, most of it on contested transit corridors, where the work was unglamorous and the coffee was terrible, and the only thing that kept you sane was the discipline of staying useful. When the auxiliary folded its forward operations, and the Interplanetary Liaison Office came recruiting for what they called cultural integration monitors, I signed the contract, mostly because the alternative was a desk in Sector 9, reviewing customs declarations. I was 37 years old. My niece had opinions about cold weather, and I had no particular objection to the idea of doing something different. They sent me to Velshuren. The planet is old. That is the first thing that registers when the transport clears the orbital ring and you see the surface. Not the color of it, though the color is remarkable. A deep blue-green that belongs more to deep ocean than to a continent, but the age of it. The architecture of the palace alone is older than any standing human structure by roughly 4,000 years. The Veluran are a long-lived people, formal in their hierarchies, precise in their customs, and deeply, almost structurally committed to the idea that rank is visible in a being's bearing, in their clothing, in the quality of the silence they command when they enter a room. They are not cruel. I want to say that clearly. They are not a cruel people, but their social architecture is built on legibility, on the assumption that what a person is can be read, if you know how to read it in about 30 seconds of observation. I had been there 8 months before I understood what that meant for me specifically. It meant I was invisible, not ignored precisely. I was acknowledged when acknowledgement was procedurally required. I was greeted at shift transitions by the palace chamberlain's secondary aide, a Talon male named Sorvith, who had the permanent expression of a man smelling something faintly disagreeable. I was provided with a guard station at the east colonnade of the Grand Investiture Hall, a bunk in the diplomatic annex, and 3 meals a day that were nutritionally calibrated for human physiology, if not exactly designed with human preference in mind. The Liaison Office had negotiated all of this. It was by every procedural measure a functioning arrangement, but in 8 months, no member of the Veluran court had spoken to me beyond the minimum required by those procedures. No courtier had paused at my station to ask where I was from, or how I found the climate, or whether the formal dialect was giving me difficulty. I was present the way a piece of diplomatic furniture is present, noted on the inventory, placed correctly, never touched. I had been in enough assignments to know that this was not malice. It was category. I did not fit into any slot the court's legibility system could read cleanly. I was not a dignitary, so the courters with titles did not engage me. I was not a servant, so the palace staff maintained a careful distance. I was not a soldier in their hierarchy, so the royal guard treated me with a polite professional weariness that never became warmth. The Liaison Office had placed me here as a gesture of interplanetary goodwill, and the palace had accepted me as such, a gesture held in the appropriate position, fulfilling its symbolic function. I did not mind it the way I might have minded it 10 years earlier. 14 years in the auxiliary will cure you of needing to be seen. You learn to be useful inside the available space, whatever that space is, and to find the work that matters, inside the work you are officially assigned to do. My official assignment was to maintain a diplomatic presence at formal court events, to be available as a liaison contact for any national who wished to initiate communication with a human representative, and to submit weekly observational reports to the liaison office. What I actually did in addition to those things was learn the palace. Not as a security exercise, though that instinct is hard to turn off. I learned it the way you learn a landscape you're going to live in for a while, where the light falls in the morning, which corridors the staff preferred, because they were cooler in the afternoon, where the garden arcade off the east wing filled with sound when the wind came from the south, because of the way the stone columns were spaced. I learned which dignitaries arrived early to formal events, and which ones swept in at the procedural last moment. I learned the rhythm of the palace, the way you learn the rhythm of any place you decide to pay attention to. And I learned the princess, not intentionally at first. She was simply there at every formal event I attended, positioned at the edge of the assembled court, in a way that I recognized from my own experience, not hiding exactly, but occupying the least occupied space available. She was 5, or the Veluran developmental equivalent of 5, which I gathered from the palace staff's interactions with her and from the way the court treated her, with a tender formality that was distinct from the way they treated her mother. She was small, even for her age. Her skin was lavender gray, lighter than most Veluran I had seen, and her eyes were very large and very dark, the color of deep water at depth, and she almost never blinked at the rate adults blinked, which gave her a watchful quality that the adults around her seemed to find disconcerting, and which I found honestly rather recognizable. Her name was Alith. I had heard it in passing from Sorvith's briefings about the formal event rosters, and from the quiet instructions given to her attendants before each ceremony. The attendants were kind to her, that was clear from their body language, even when I could not hear what they said, but the kindness had a careful quality, a practiced gentleness that suggested they were working around something fragile. The Queen's consort had died 7 months before my arrival. I had not known him. I knew him only as an absence, as the particular shape of the space the court moved around without naming. I had read the liaison office's briefing notes, which described the loss in administrative terms, and noted that the Queen had maintained full performance of her ceremonial duties throughout the mourning period, which the briefing presented as a positive indicator of political stability. What the briefing did not note, because briefings do not note these things, was what 7 months of watching your parent perform stability had done to a 5-year-old who did not yet have the architecture for it. What it had done, as far as I could observe, was silence her. Not permanently, I did not think. But for the duration of those 8 months I was stationed at Veluran, Princess Alith did not speak, not at formal events, not in the corridors when I passed her with her attendants, not when the court's children, the sons and daughters of various dignitaries, who were sometimes present at less formal gatherings, attempted to draw her into whatever they were doing. She watched everything with those large, dark, water-deep eyes, and she was perfectly cooperative with her attendants, and she sat where she was placed, and stood when she was meant to stand, and she did not speak, and she did not reach for anyone. I noticed her because I recognized the posture, not grief exactly. I am not equipped to diagnose grief in a species I have known for 8 months, but the specific quality of presence that comes from having learned that the performance is what is needed right now, and committing to the performance and holding everything else very still inside it. I knew that posture. I had worn it. I imagine most people who have spent time in difficult assignments have worn it. I did not do anything about it because there was nothing to do. She was a royal child in a formal court, and I was a human diplomatic liaison guard, and the space between those two categories was not one I had any business crossing. I simply noticed her the way I noticed everything about the palace I was living in, and I went about my work, and the days accumulated. The grand investiture is held once a year in the Veluran ceremonial calendar, which does not map evenly onto the standard calendar, but which fell in my posting in the equivalent of late autumn. It is the largest formal event the palace hosts, an assembly of every dignitary, ambassador, court official, and ranking noble who holds any form of relationship with the Veluran throne, plus a substantial number of invited guests, whose presence signals various diplomatic alignments. The hall seats approximately 300 at formal capacity. On the day in question, it held 243, plus palace staff positioned along the walls at intervals, plus me at my east colonnade pillar, where I had stood at every formal event for 8 months, without once having been spoken to by any of the assembled guests. The ceremony had been running for about 40 minutes. I have been standing for those 40 minutes in the posture that the Frontier Auxiliary trains into you, weight balanced, attention diffused, aware of the whole room without fixing on any part of it, present but not consuming space. The queen was on the throne dais at the far end of the hall, elevated 4 steps composed as she always was, copper bronze skin, silver white hair coiled close to her head, in a formal style I had learned was reserved for investiture occasions, amber eyes that moved across the assembly with the practiced evenness of someone who has spent her entire life reading rooms and has learned not to let the reading show on her face. She was wearing deep blue formal robes that caught the light from the hall's high clear-story windows, and there was a collar of worked silver at her throat, and she was, by any measure I had available to me, the most composed person in the room. She had been the most composed person in every room I had seen her in. That composure had a quality I had come to think of privately as load-bearing, the kind that is not ease but discipline, the kind that holds a great deal of weight by refusing to let the weight show. I noticed Aith approximately 2 minutes into my concern. She was positioned as she always was at formal events to the left of the dais, slightly behind the line of senior court officials with her 2 attendants flanking her. I had placed her in my peripheral awareness when I first took my position, as I did at every event, the same way I placed all the non-mobile elements of the room. At the 42-minute mark of the ceremony, I registered a change in that peripheral position. The small shape that had been there was no longer there. I did not alarm. I moved my attention to the east corridor entrance, which was the nearest exit, and the direction I would have gone if I were small and overwhelmed, and needed to not be in the room anymore. She was not there. I moved it to the rear gallery stairs. Not there. I brought my attention fully into the room and swept it methodically, the way you sweep a perimeter when something has changed. And then I found her. She was 20 feet away from me and moving steadily. She was crossing the floor of the grand investiture hall, the open ceremonial space between the assembled dignitaries and the east colonnade alone without her attendants, walking with the careful, deliberate step of a child who has decided on a direction and is executing it. The hall was large enough and the ceremony loud enough at that moment that the first several people to notice her did so with a delayed blink. The small shape moving through peripheral vision, the double take, the slow realization that the queen's daughter was crossing the investiture floor unaccompanied. I watched the ripple of that realization move through the room. It moved slowly at first, then faster, the way a stone dropped in water sends rings outward. Heads turned. Conversations broke off. The dignitary nearest to her path, a tall Valoran male in gold court dress, one of the senior ambassadors, stepped back slightly, not out of alarm but out of the instinct to clear space for something whose category he had not yet determined. One of Aleth's attendants, now visible near the dais edge, had gone very still in the way that means a person is trying not to make a situation worse by moving. The queen had seen her. I knew because the amber eyes had stilled not with panic, but with the particular stillness of a parent who has registered their child doing something unexpected in public, and is calculating the correct response while maintaining external composure. She did not rise from the throne yet. She watched. Aleth did not look at her mother. She did not look at the assembled dignitaries. She did not look at her attendants. She walked across the floor of the grand investiture hall with her eyes on me, and when she reached me, when she stopped in front of my position at the east colonnade pillar, directly in front of me, close enough that I had to look down to see her face. She reached up and put her hand in mine. Her hand was small. That sounds obvious, but it is the detail I remember most clearly, the smallness of it, and the deliberateness of the grip. She did not take my fingers tentatively, the way a child tests an uncertain surface. She took my hand the way you take hold of something you have decided to take hold of with a firm and considered grip, and then she looked up at me with those very large dark eyes. And she did not say anything, and she did not look frightened, and she did not look like she was performing anything. She looked like she had simply decided where she wanted to be, and had gone there. The hall was by this point almost entirely silent. I want to be precise about what that silence was. It was not the silence of an emergency. It was not alarm, not the sharp intake of collective breath that precedes a crisis. It was something more like the silence that falls when 243 people simultaneously encounter something they do not have a category for, and their category-making apparatus pauses for the half-second it takes to search the available frameworks before concluding quietly that this particular moment does not fit any of them. The queen's daughter, who had not voluntarily touched anyone in 7 months, had crossed the full length of the grand investiture hall and taken the hand of the human diplomatic liaison guard. I did not let go of her hand. I want to be clear about that because there will be people who wonder if that was the instinctive response or the calculated one. It was neither. It was simply what was true. She had taken my hand and my hand stayed where it was because the alternative was to withdraw it, and I was not going to do that. A child had decided she wanted to hold my hand and I was not going to take my hand away. What I did do after approximately 2 seconds was crouch, not suddenly. I brought myself down slowly, the way you move around something small and certain until I was at her eye level. She had to look slightly less far up to find my face, and when she did, her expression did not change. The same watchful, water-deep eyes, the same considering gravity that I had observed from 30 feet away at every formal event for 8 months. Up close, it was more specific. There was no fear in it. There was no appeal in it. No small child performance of need or distress. She had come here because she had decided to come here, and she was here, and that was the fact. And she was looking at me with the calm assessment of someone who has arrived at a destination and is now evaluating whether the destination matches the expectation. I met her eyes. I did not smile in a way that was meant to be reassuring, because reassuring smiles are for when someone is afraid, and she was not afraid. I looked at her the way you look at someone you respect steadily, with attention present. I kept my hand where it was. Her grip did not loosen behind her. I could feel the silence of the room doing something. Pressure is not the right word. Wait, maybe 243 people not breathing in quite the same way they had been breathing 30 seconds ago, and then I heard the sound of footsteps on the day of stairs. Not running, not hurried, the measured, deliberate step of someone descending 4 steps under full court observation, and choosing the pace of that descent with precision. I did not look up immediately. I stayed where I was, crouched at Eighth's eye level, her hand in mine, and I heard the footsteps cross the open floor toward us, and I waited until they stopped. Then I looked up. Queen Thessera Valuran was standing approximately 4 feet from us. She had come down from the dais, crossed the ceremonial floor, and stopped at a distance that was close, but not crowding. The distance of someone who is approaching something carefully and knows it. She was taller than I had registered from my colonnade position, or perhaps it was simply that I was crouching and she was standing, but her presence at close range had a quality I had not been able to gauge from across the room. The composure was still there. The load-bearing discipline was still in her face. But underneath it, in the amber eyes, there was something else. Something that had shifted or cracked slightly in the way that things shift when they have been held rigidly for a long time, and then encounter something unexpected. She was looking at Aleth first. Her daughter had not turned at the sound of the footsteps. She was still looking at me, still holding my hand, and her mother was looking at her with an expression that I will not try to name because I did not have the vocabulary for it in any language I spoke. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The queen looking at her daughter holding a stranger's hand in the middle of the grand investiture hall, a thing that had not happened in 7 months, a thing that the attendants and the court physicians and the carefully managed schedule of normalized activity had not produced. And then the queen's gaze lifted to me. I met it. I did not look away. I did not perform deference or apology. I was crouching on the floor of the investiture hall holding the hand of her daughter, and I looked at the queen the way I looked at everyone, steadily, with full attention, without performing anything. My face was probably not doing much. 14 years in the auxiliary will train expressiveness out of you in operational contexts, and this felt like an operational context in the sense that what mattered right now was staying very still and not doing anything that would make the next 10 seconds worse. The queen said, in formal Valuran, "She has not reached for anyone." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the flat statement of a fact that she was in the process of processing, said in a register. I had not heard her use at any formal event, quieter than her ceremonial voice, without the projection and precision of public address. She said it the way you say something you are still making sense of out loud, because saying it aloud is part of making sense of it. I said in my best formal velour, "I know your majesty." She looked at me for another moment. Then she did something I had not anticipated, and for which I was certain there was no protocol anywhere in the liaison office's guidance documents. She grouched Queen Thessera Valuran in her deep blue investiture robes and her worked silver collar in front of 243 assembled dignitaries, and every senior court official of the Valeran throne, lowered herself to the floor until she was at the same level as her daughter. The silence of the room shifted again. If it had been a held breath before, it was now a stopped breath, the specific quality of collective stillness. That means every person in the room has decided simultaneously not to move. Eighth, for the first time since she had taken my hand, turned her head. She looked at her mother. Her mother was right there, at her level. The amber eyes very close, the composure present, but changed somehow, altered at its surface by the simple fact of being on the floor. Aelith looked at her mother, and I felt the grip on my hand change. Not release, but shift. The way a grip shifts when the person holding on has registered something and is recalibrating. Then Aelith reached out her other hand and took her mother's. I do not know how long we stayed like that. It was not long measured in seconds. It felt long in the way that certain moments feel long, not because time has slowed, but because a great deal is happening inside a small interval. The Queen's composure was doing something I had not seen it do before. Not breaking, that is not the right word. But the load-bearing quality of it was redistributing. The way a structure redistributes load when something it was compensating for is suddenly different. Her daughter was holding her hand. After whatever interval it was, the Queen looked up from Aelith's face to mine. I was still crouching, still holding Aelith's right hand, the Queen holding her left. The three of us approximately in a line on the floor of the Grand Investiture Hall, while 243 people watched from a careful distance, and not one of them made a sound. She said, still in that quieter register, "What did you do?" I thought about it. I said I stood at my post. She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, partly because emotional registers were still not fully legible to me after 8 months, and partly because this particular expression did not seem to map cleanly onto any register I had catalogued. It was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was not surprise, or not only surprise. It had the quality of something recalibrating, like the moment in a field assessment, when you have been working with an incomplete map, and you receive the information that changes how everything on that map is positioned. She was recalibrating me. I could see it happening. In 8 months of standing at my post, she had not in any meaningful sense looked at me. I had been present the way the colonnade pillars were present, structurally noted, positionally registered, not examined. And now she was examining me from a distance of perhaps 3 feet on the floor of her investiture hall, and I had no idea what she was finding. She said 8 months. Yes, Your Majesty. You have stood at that post for 8 months. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I am told your reports to the liaison office describe the court as functioning well. They do, I said. Is that what you observe? I considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, and I was not certain this was the moment for the complicated answer. But she had asked it in that quiet register on the floor of the hall with her daughter holding both our hands, and it did not feel like a ceremonial question. It felt like the question a person asks when they have for a moment stopped performing and want an actual answer. I said the court performs well, Your Majesty. Whether performing and functioning are the same thing is a question I am probably not qualified to answer. She was quiet again for a longer moment. Then she said, That is a more precise answer than I expected. I was in the auxiliary for 14 years, I said. We learned to distinguish between the two. Something moved in the amber eyes. Not quite a smile. The Velshore informal expression register does not map precisely onto human facial expressions, and I had learned not to overinterpret movement at the mouth or eyes as indicators of specific human emotional states, but something a slight shift in the quality of the attention she was paying me. She looked down at Aelith, who was still holding both our hands and looking between us with those large dark eyes, taking in the exchange with the careful assessment of a child who understands more of the adult conversation happening over her head than the adults realize. The Queen said softly in a register that I was fairly certain was not intended for the assembled court. She has not chosen to be close to anyone since her father died. I said, I know. You noticed. Yes. Why did you not? She stopped. She seemed to reconsider the question, or the phrasing of it. Then she said, You did not approach her. It was not my place to. I said, She is the princess, and I am a diplomatic liaison guard. I stood at my post, and yet she came to you. Yes, I said she did. The Queen looked at me for a moment that felt weighted in the way that certain pauses are weighted when they are not empty but full. Full of the recalibration happening underneath the silence. Then she did something else I had not anticipated. She said, I do not know your name. 8 months. I had stood at the east colonnade pillar for 8 months, and the Queen of Velurin did not know my name. That was not an accusation in her voice, or a confession of indifference. It was simply the flat acknowledgement of a fact stated in the same register she had used for the other flat facts, the one she was in the process of making sense of. I said, Corrindale, Your Majesty, Diplomatic Liaison, Interplanetary Liaison Office, assigned to Velurin Palace. She repeated it, not the full title, just the name, Corrindale, as if placing it somewhere, as if the name, having been said aloud, now had a location in the architecture of things she knew. Then she said, My daughter has chosen you, Corvindale. I was not sure what that meant in Velour terms. I knew enough of their cultural framework to know that the word she used, not the standard verb for preference or selection, but a specific word I had encountered in formal contexts involving binding decisions, carried weight beyond simple preference, but I did not want to presume a meaning I might be getting wrong. I said, I am honored by her trust, Your Majesty. It is more than trust, the Queen said. In our custom, when a child of royal line chooses, she paused. She looked at Aeth, then back at me. It is a formal matter. It will need to be addressed formally. I understand, I said, though I was not certain I fully did. Although who had been listening to all of this with those water-deep eyes moving between us, tightened her grip on my hand just slightly. The way you tighten a grip when you want the thing you are holding to stay. I held on. The Queen watched that small adjustment of grip. The expression on her face, the one I could not fully categorize, the one that had the quality of recalibration, moved again, shifted into something that was still not quite any expression I had a clean name for, but that felt in some way I was responding to without fully processing, like something becoming possible that had not been possible before. She said, The ceremony will conclude now. I glanced up at the assembled court for the first time since Alith had taken my hand. 243 people, every one of them watching, not one of them moving. The silence of the room so complete that I could hear the ambient sound the high clear-story windows made when the wind came from the south. Senior ambassadors, court officials, every titled person who held any relationship with the Velurin throne, they had all seen all of it, the crossing of the floor, the taking of the hand, the Queen descending from her dais, the three of us crouching on the investiture floor while the ceremony waited. Whatever this meant in Velshore protocol, whatever the formal weight of the child's choosing carried in their customs, it had been witnessed by everyone whose witnessing could possibly matter. I looked back at the Queen. She was already rising smoothly with the same measured deliberateness she had used to descend the dais. She extended a hand to Alith, and Alieth released my hand fully without reluctance in the natural way that children release one hand when they are going to take another, and took her mother's hand. Then Alith looked back at me. She had not to this point made any sound at all. Not in the crossing of the hall, not in the holding of my hand, not in the quiet exchange between her mother and me. She had been entirely present and entirely silent, with those large dark eyes doing all the work. She looked at me, and then she said one word. Her voice was very small, and the word was informal, and I almost missed it, because the word she used was not a word I had ever heard her use before, because I had never heard her use any word before. But I caught it, and I understood it. It was the Velshurin word for stay. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said informal Velurin because the word she had used was formal and she deserved a formal answer. I am not going anywhere. The Queen standing beside her daughter heard this. She did not look at me immediately. She looked at Alith, who was looking at me with an expression that had changed slightly. The considering gravity still there, but warmer somehow, as if a door somewhere in it had opened a small amount. Then the Queen looked at me, and the expression that had been recalibrating all the way through this exchange arrived finally at something I could name. It was not gratitude, though there was gratitude somewhere in it. It was not relief, though there was relief. It was the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and has in this moment registered the presence of someone else in the same room with the load. She said, No, I do not think you are. Then she turned with Alith's hand in hers, and walked back across the investiture floor toward the dais. I straightened up from my crouch. My knees expressed their opinion of the past several minutes. I returned to my post at the east colonnade pillar, which was where I had been standing for 8 months, and which was, as far as I could tell, where I would continue to stand until I received instructions to the contrary. The ceremony resumed. The Chamberlain, who had the professional gift of producing normally in abnormal situations, stepped forward and redirected the assembly's attention back to the formal agenda with a smoothness I genuinely admired. The dignitaries turned back to the proceedings. The ambient sound of the hall refilled low formal conversation, the rustle of formal clothing, the quiet work of the palace staff along the walls. At the dais, Queen Thessera sat in the throne with Aeth beside her, not in the usual attendant position placement slightly behind the dais, but directly at her mother's side, the small lavender gay hand still holding the copper bronze one. The queen's composure was back in place, formal and precise and load-bearing, but Aeth, from her position at the queen's side, was watching me. I stood at my post and I watched the rest of the ceremony, and at intervals when I moved my attention to the dais. The princess was watching me with those large, dark, water-deep eyes, and whenever she found my gaze, she did not look away. That was 3 months ago. I will not tell you that everything changed at once because that is not how things change. Change is mostly slow and mostly quiet, and mostly made up of small things accumulating, until one day you look at the shape of the ordinary and realize it is different from what the ordinary used to be. The investiture ceremony was not the end of anything or the beginning of everything. It was one moment, and then there were other moments, and the other moments built on it in the way that things build when the foundation has shifted. What I can tell you is what is different now. 3 days after the investiture ceremony, Sorth, the Chamberlain's secondary aide, the man with the permanent expression of mild electory displeasure, came to my guard station and informed me that Her Majesty had requested that the liaison office consider extending my posting at Valuran for an additional term. He delivered this information with the same professional neutrality with which he delivered all information, but there was something in his manner that was, if not warmer, then less cool than it had been. And after he delivered the message, he paused for approximately 3 additional seconds before turning to leave, which was unusual enough that I noted it. The Lazison office agreed to the extension. The week after that, I was moved from the diplomatic annex to a room in the East Wing residential corridor, closer to the palace proper, closer to the formal rooms. Sorth explained that the adjustment reflected my changed assignment scope. He did not elaborate on what the changed assignment scope was. I did not ask, because in the auxiliary you learn that sometimes things are explained, and sometimes things simply happen, and both are information. What the changed assignment scope turned out to mean in practice was that I accompanied the Queen's formal schedule more closely, not as a diplomatic courtesy fixture at the colonnade, as an actual presence in the working rhythm of the court. In the mornings, I was at the gallery briefings. In the afternoons, I was available for liaison consultation that, to my surprise, began to actually be consulted. Dignitaries who had spent 8 months looking through me began to look at me, not with warmth in most cases, not yet, but with attention. The legibility system was slowly resorting me. And Aeth, who had not spoken a word before the investiture ceremony, began to speak, not immediately, not in a rush, in the slow, particular way that a child who has been holding something and learns to let it out one word at a time, in the spaces where the words felt safe. She spoke to her mother first, which was as it should be. She spoke to her attendants next, then over the weeks that followed to me. The first full sentence she said to me, not counting the one word she had said in the investiture hall, which I regarded as complete in itself, was, "Do you know where the South Garden is?" I did know where the South Garden was. I had spent 8 months learning the palace, I told her, and she looked at me with that considering gravity, and she said, "I will show you anyway." And she did. We walked through the South Garden for approximately 45 minutes. She showed me everything, the names of the plants, informal Valuran, and in what I gathered was a private informal naming system of her own invention, the place where the light came through the trellis work in the late morning and made a particular pattern on the path, the corner where the wind made a sound she liked. She explained all of this in the careful, precise way that children explain things they know well to adults they have decided might be worth explaining things to. I listened. I asked the questions that the explanations opened up. We walked the full circuit of the garden twice. When we came back to the eastern arcade, the Queen was standing at the arcade entrance. She had not been there when we left. She had come out to find us, or to be there when we came back. I was not certain which. Al-Hith released my hand when she saw her mother, and went forward with the natural unhurried step of a child going to a parent, and the queen received her with both arms and a composure that was no longer load-bearing because it no longer needed to be. She looked at me over the top of her daughter's head. I was standing at the arcade entrance with my hands at my sides, the afternoon light coming in at a low angle through the columns, the garden behind me. I was not performing anything. I was just there the way I had been at the East Colonnade for 8 months, present useful inside the available space, finding the work that mattered. She said the liaison office sent a request for your quarterly evaluation. Yes. I said I should have that filed by week's end. I have already sent them a report, she said. I was not certain what to say to that, so I said nothing. She said, I told them that your work here has been excellent, that your presence has been of considerable benefit to the court's diplomatic functions. She paused, and that I hoped you would stay for as long as you were willing. I looked at her. The amber eyes were direct without the ceremonial distance that had characterized every exchange I had observed her in over the preceding 8 months. Up close, the way I had first seen them on the investiture floor, they were warmer than they had registered from across a formal hall. The grief was still in them. Grief does not depart on a schedule, but it was differently positioned than it had been. Redistributed. The way load redistributes when a structure finds a new bearing point. I said, I have no plans to go anywhere, Your Majesty. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the quieter register, the one she had used on the investiture floor, the one that had nothing of ceremony in it. Thesara. I blinked. Your Majesty. When we are not in formal session, she said, my name is Thesara. She glanced down at Aeth, who was watching both of us with those large, dark eyes, and the small private expression that I had come to recognize as her version of satisfaction. My daughter has apparently decided that we are past the formal forms of address. I looked at Alith. Alith looked at me. I said Corin. Then the Queen Thesara looked at me for one more moment with that expression that still did not fit cleanly into any category I had, but that I was getting better at reading. Then she put her hand on the top of Alith's head gently, and she said to her daughter in the informal register, Come then, it is nearly time for your studies. Alith went with her. At the corner of the arcade, she turned and looked back at me, and said one word, in the same formal register she had used in the investiture hall. The same word, stay. I said, I am not going anywhere. She turned back and went with her mother, and I stood in the afternoon light at the entrance to the East Arcade for a moment, listening to the wind come through the garden and make the sound she liked, and then I went back to my post and did my work. I filed my quarterly evaluation at week's end. I noted that the Valuran posting was proceeding well. I noted that diplomatic relations were developing in ways that warranted continued engagement. I noted that I was available for an extended term if the liaison office saw fit. They approved it the following week. I am still here. The palace has not from the outside changed significantly. The court still performs its formal functions with the precision and deliberateness that 8 months of observation had led me to expect. Sorvith's expression has moved from mild electory displeasure to something closer to neutral, which in his register may be affection. The dignitaries who used to look through me have begun one by one to look at me, the legibility system sorting me gradually into something it can place. Alith talks now not constantly. She is a child who has found that silence is also a choice, and she exercises the choice, and that is as it should be. But she talks in the South Garden, and at the breakfast briefing she has started attending the edge of, and in the East Arcade, in the late afternoon, when the light comes through the columns, and occasionally in the mornings, when she finds me at my new position, not the colonnade anymore, but the gallery outside the Queen's working chambers. She stops and says something or asks something, and I answer, and she considers the answer with those large, dark, water-deep eyes, and then continues on her way, satisfied or not satisfied, having decided something. I do not always know what she has decided. I am not certain it matters. She comes back the last time she stopped at my post. She said in the informal register, which I had been hearing her use more, Do you know what my father's name was? I said I did not. She said Veal. She said it carefully. The way you say a word you want to make sure comes out right. He was tall. He was quieter than my mother. He made a sound when he laughed that I cannot remember anymore, and I am trying to remember it. I said that is a hard thing. She said yes. She looked at me for a moment with a considering gravity. You are also quiet. I said yes. She said, It is not the same as is quiet. No, I said it is not. She thought about this. Then she said, "But it is a good quiet." Then she went to her studies, and I stood at my post in the morning light, outside the Queen's chambers, and the palace moved around me, the way the palace moves in its old formal, precisely calibrated rhythms, and I was for the first time in 8 months, not invisible inside it. That is what she did, that small girl with the large dark eyes and the decided grip. She crossed a floor and took my hand and showed 243 people, and a queen who had been performing stability for 7 months, without anyone to share the load. That plain human steadiness in the end is legible to anyone willing to look. I did not do anything extraordinary. I stood at my post. I noticed her. I let her hold my hand, and I did not let go, and I stayed where I said I would stay. But sometimes that is what is needed in a palace full of people performing what is required. Sometimes what is needed is someone who simply stays.